Hey guys, John V here from PhoneArena. Right now you're watching our in-depth video comparison between the LG G2 and the Nokia Lumia 1020, both flagship smartphones, Windows Phone 8, Android of course. We know that the LG G2 is just one specs powerhouse, whereas with the Lumia 1020, it's all about the camera with its 41 megapixel pure view camera. There's a lot to like about each other, but only one can reign supreme, so let's find out. The G2 has a nice design on its own, but the Lumia 1020 continues to have that attractive design to catch the attention of bystanders. For example, it's just very different from other things out there, and you could argue that the G2 looks like any other flagship smartphone out there with its plastic construction. In fact, both are plastic, but the polycarbonate matte finish of the Lumia 1020 just has a sturdier feel to it. The G2 though is by far the skinnier device, and it's not as beefy compared to the Lumia 1020. It's made out of this glossy plastic which tends to show a lot more smudge and fingerprints, but when it's polished and clean, it has a nice pattern in the rear. And ultimately it just boils down, which one you like. Do you like the angular straight hard lines of the Lumia 1020 or just the more subtle approach of the G2? Hands down, folks, it's the G2 that has the better looking display. It's both larger and higher resolution too. It's a 5.2-inch advanced IPS LCD panel in there versus the smaller 4.5-inch AMOLED display on the Lumia 1020. They have their attractive elements, great wide viewing angles, but when it comes to outdoor visibility, it's the G2 that really wins. So whereas with the Lumia 1020, it tends to wash out and distort. When it comes to details, again, it's the G2 that has it just because it's 1080p resolution, so 1920 by 1080 versus the 768 by 1280 resolution on the Lumia 1020. Now, even though there's a big win for the G2, you really don't notice the detail superiority unless you look very close. From a normal distance away, it's really hard to tell which is better between the two. Taking a quick look around the bezels, we have some common ports. For example, the micro USB port for charging data connectivity. You have also their speakers, internal speakers, 3.5mm headset jacks. It's on the bottom on the G2 versus on top on the Lumia 1020. Power button and volume controls are placed in the back on the G2, so it's a little bit awkward at first. It might not feel as distinctive when compared to the Lumia 1020's physical buttons, but it still works in the end. It's worth noting though that the LG G2 also features a built-in IR blaster, which benefits the handset just because it turns it to a universal remote. That's something that the Lumia 1020 doesn't offer. Around the rear, we have their cameras. It's a 13 megapixel autofocus camera in the LG G2 versus the 41 megapixel pure view camera of the Lumia 1020. It's something we've come to expect in this day and age with flagship smartphones, but there isn't any sort of expandable storage with either handset. Instead, we got to rely on their built-in memory, which is actually 32 gigabytes on both. It's Android and a Windows Phone 8 device. We've seen this comparison many times and it doesn't really change this time around. Of course, when it comes to personalization options, you can get a ton more with the Android 4.2.2 Jelly Bean experience of the LG G2. That's just because you have all the widgets that you can place throughout the home screen. On top of that, you can even modify things like the animation with the home screen and even add a live wallpaper if you like. It's just very deep and has a really nice ecosystem. In comparison, the Windows Phone 8 experience of the Nokia Lumia 1020 is a little bit laid back. It doesn't have as much personalization options, but still continues to attract us with its fancy looking start screen. With all the live tiles, you can resize them and they aggregate some useful information. Android continues to offer the better implementation when it comes to notifications, just because with the notifications panel, you can get all the stuff directly from there, and you also have some different functions depending on what it is. And on top of that, you could see we have also access to a bunch of connectivity features and even other things like the volume and also brightness with the Nokia Lumia 1020 and Windows Phone 8. You're mainly held to viewing your notifications on the start screen. You can see depending on what app it is or what live tile, you have to search around for this notification. There isn't really a centralized hub for it. At the same time, we prefer the G2 and the way it handles multitasking too. Of course, the core basics are pretty much the same with both handsets. You have it also available with the Nokia Lumia 1020 and Windows Phone 8. You have the smaller windows, which allows us to quickly switch between open applications, and pretty much works in the same manner as what you have with typical Android, but The G2 steps it up just a little bit more just because you have things like the two-slide applications, which allows us to layer specific applications on top of whatever we're doing. So it's pretty useful in that. And you also have slide aside, which allows us to store up to 3 applications, so you could quickly switch between them at any time. Despite having the size advantage with its display, there isn't much of a difference between the size layouts of their on-screen keyboards. Pretty much identical, as you can tell here. And on top of that, both are very responsive to touch. No issues typing up long messages. But there's something about the Windows Phone 8 keyboard on the Lumia 1020 that we prefer it over the LG G2. For starters, it has a killer autocorrect feature and also provides us with a hassle-free experience. There's also no comparison when checking out their voice assistant services. You have Google Now on the LG G2 and the Bing service on the Nokia Lumia 1020. With Google Now, it's by far more comprehensive, providing us with relevant and also pertinent information like the weather, sports scores, even directions to and from from work. Whereas with the Bing service, it's mostly reserved for web searches. In addition, you also have the VoiceMate application on board with the G2. It supplements Google Now. It's LG's own homebrewed voice assistant service. So basically, it pretty much is activated via voice. So you could say stuff like, "What's the weather like?" And of course, you're going to get some relevant information with the LG G2. So it displays the temperature and all the useful information, whereas with the Windows Phone 8, it just mainly goes to a web search. This is a perfect example where specs really don't matter, just because with the LG G2, it's the newer handset, so it benefits from having a newer hardware versus the Lumia 1020. It's a quad-core 2.26 GHz Qualcomm Snapdragon 800 processor with 2 GB of RAM on the LG G2 versus the dual-core 1.5 GHz Qualcomm Snapdragon S4 Plus processor with 2 GB of RAM on the Nokia Lumia 1020. And quite frankly, when it comes to basic operations, they both exhibit the same level of performances. Very instantaneous, barely any lag or slowdown with either device. We're very happy with them. And even with things like games, they're both equipped at handling them. Naturally, surfing the web isn't a problem with either device, just because you have 4G LTE connectivity in tow with both, so you have fast page loads. And on top of that, you have very smooth kinetic scrolling and instant page rendering, so not a problem with either device. The only difference here is just with the higher resolution and larger display, slightly larger display of the LG G2, so you see a little bit more on screen. And when you look very close, we could tell the detail superiority of its actual display. On the LG G2, you have 2 options for music players. You have the Google Play Music application or LG's own homebrewed one. As far as the presentation style, it's not as cool looking compared to the default music player on the Nokia Lumia 1020. That's thanks in part to its modern UI, which gives it a very snazzy look. Now, as far as the audio quality with the respective speakers, both are very powerful and strong, and quite frankly, we don't notice any difference between the two. Either handset's great for watching high-definition videos. They support a wide array of codecs out of the box, and you can tell right now the playback's very smooth with barely any evidence of any stutter whatsoever. Now, it all boils down to which display is going to attract you more, the AMOLED display of the Lumia 1020 or the LG G2's IPS LCD panel. Now, they're both wonderful in many ways, but you got to think about it, you get a slightly larger display on the LG G2. At the same time, it's also higher resolution, and you also get superior outdoor visibility with it. By now, we all know that the Lumia 1020 really has a lot of emphasis when it comes to the photo experience, and you can tell right away with its UI for the app. But honestly, don't count out the LG G2. It still has some useful things on its own. Now, as far as the UI and the options available, you're pretty much going to be equal with both. You have a lot of different shooting modes available, some manual controls too. With the Lumia 1020, it kind of adheres to the styling of a traditional camera, so we have access to controlling things like the white balance, the ISO, the focus, the shutter speed, so a lot of cool stuff. But the LG G2 also has some of those features you can modify. So for example, the ISO, the brightness, the exposure, and even some things like the color effects, which is pretty nice. Additionally, it's pretty quick and easy to actually launch their camera apps. With the LG G2, all you gotta do is just hold down the volume down button for a couple seconds, and on the Lumia 1020, hold down the dedicated shutter key for the same amount of time. The question that remains now is which of the two has the superior camera? It's a 13 megapixel autofocus camera in the LG G2 versus the 41 megapixel monster pure view camera of the Lumia 1020. Now, in the Lumia 1020, it takes 2 different types of shots you have a 5 megapixel sample and the full-size 38 megapixel one. Now when it comes to outdoor shots, honestly, the qualities are pretty much identical. We love both, and it's hardly negligible which one is going to be the better between the two. They take some really sharp looking details, nice visuals. Color reproduction is a little bit different on both. You tend to see some cooler tones on the LG G2 versus some warmer tones produced by the Lumia 1020. But it's in the lower lighting conditions where we see the biggest difference. The Lumia 1020 is just better able to handle dynamic range, so you don't see a huge disparity between light and darker areas. And on top of that, when we compare the 5 megapixel samples to the LG G2 snapshots, they're pretty much more identical. It's a clear victory for the Lumia 1020 when it comes to still image capture quality, but when it comes to high definition video recording quality, it's a close race, but it's again the Lumia 1020 that's edging out the LG G2. Now it's worth mentioning with the LG G2 and its 1080p recording quality, it's able to shoot in both 30 frames per second and 60 frames per second. So you get that cool motion and effect with 60 frames per second. It's not something we see on other smartphones out there. But the Lumia 1020 has its own mixed bag of goodies. You have the traditional 30 frames per second capture, you have also 25 frames per second, and you have the cool cinematic mode of 24 frames per second. Now the samples that we're going to show you here is the 30 frames per second capture with the Lumia 1020 and the 60 frames per second one on the LG G2. Now we like the qualities of both, but there are some distracting things that we'll point out. Now with the Lumia 1020, there's just some artifacting that pops up as you're panning, so it kind of softens the details. And with the LG G2, it has a lower exposure, so it tends to come off as dark, and at the same time with that, it tends to miss out on some of the details. But both are still very nice looking, very smooth, no stutter, and we like both, but in the end, we're going to stick with the Lumia 1020. We're really not blown away by the call quality on either handsets, and at the end of the day, they're both nothing more than average, and there are some things that's worth mentioning here. With the Lumia 1020, the earpiece and both speakerphone are rather weak in tone, so it can make for some very difficult conversations, especially in noisy environments. And with the LG G2, its microphone causes voice to sound a little bit on the unnatural side. It's really hard for us to wrap our heads around it, especially when we know that the LG G2 has the slimmer profile between the two handsets. It's packing the larger 3000 mAh battery versus the smaller 2000 mAh one in the Lumia 1020. And with that, we're able to get by a day and a half of normal usage out of the LG G2 versus only 18 hours on the Lumia 1020. So who doesn't love saving money? It's pretty good, right? Having free money everywhere. So if you're in that boat, you probably pretty much want to stick with the LG G2 just because you're going to save $100 picking it up at $200 a 2-year contract. Whereas with the Lumia 1020, just expect to fork over $300 with a 2-year contract for this device. And in this day and age, that's pretty much an excessive cost, especially when you factor in its modest spec sheet. Then again, if you love taking photos and videos, this is the device you want to go with. But aside from that, if you want the better device that has the all-around performance, no question about it, the LG G2 with this one. So if you guys want to learn about either handsets, you can check out our website, PhoneArena.com. It's John V. Thanks for watching.